The front door resisted like a jaw clenched against confession, then yielded with a shudder. She stepped inside to save a forgotten library, not to live here. Beams sagged. A corridor to the stacks had buckled, blocking the way. Mold laced the air. Rot nibbled the shelves she could not reach. Every hour the damp devoured marginalia, letters, breath of the dead. No budget, no backup, only her ledger and resolve. Beneath the dust, an iron scent threaded the room. In a floor crack, something corroded flashed, small, unreachable, waiting. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from so you don't miss what the house withholds. The deed felt heavier than paper. It felt like a vow sealed with salt air and seamed wood. She didn't inherit a fortune. She inherited an obligation. The manor clung to a cliff where the coastal wind scraped its stones raw, windows clouded with salt bloom, gutters choked with needles. A world that had once been orderly, now softened by weather and neglect. The library lay past a hallway that had torqued under years of settling, the floor pitching like a deck in storm. She set her bag down and listened. The air was heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of long decayed hay from some forgotten straw packing. The house did not groan. It regarded her. It was not merely abandoned. It had been used with purpose and perhaps with secrecy. Her goal was simple and impossible. Stabilize a path, assess what could be triaged, then begin cataloging before the damp chewed the edges into lace. The weight of history sat heavy in her hands even before she lifted a book. She thought of paper as lungs. Save what breathes first. Everything else waits. Permits for shoring would be weeks. The neighbors, faces at a distance above the hedgerow, told her the place was cursed, or worse, headed for litigation. She took out her ledger and began. Warped doors, fractured joists, fungal bloom blooming again after last night's fog. She mapped the load paths on graph paper and tapped each board with a knuckle. Hollow here, sound there. She tore linen sheets into bands to strap loose spines. She pinned back curtains to let a path of light slide along the floor, then covered glass to protect bindings from glare. She moved slowly, steadily, like a conservator unthreading a knot. The micro-discoveries kept her moving. An ex libris plate embossed with a crest, 3 feathers and a knot, recurring like a quiet signature through disparate books. A faint soot line along one shelf's underside, as if hands had lifted and replaced the whole case more times than a household would admit. The pattern unsettled her. Shelves should gather dust evenly. This one breathed. As the afternoon thinned, a packet of letters slipped from a cracked quarto. Margins carried notes in sepia ink, compact, disciplined, a voice that trusted paper. On the final leaf, a sentence had been pinned with a firm hand. The box must outlive me. No signature. The crest stamped faintly in the corner. She followed the corridor toward the sealed library door and found the true blockade. A collapse of plaster and lath, the hallway bowed inward like a ribcage struck hard. Beyond it, the scent changed. Damp, yes, but threaded with iron. She scraped with a trowel, clearing a palm-wide gap under the debris, then reached. Her fingers brushed grit, then something smoother, curved. She widened the gap, coughed through the dust, and uncovered a palm-sized metal capsule, reliquary-like, its seam fused with corrosion. She felt an immediate impulse to force it, to discover. She set it down instead. What the character wants. Entry. verification, a breathing inventory. What blocks her? The building itself, old choices embedded in brick. Consequences of failure, not resale, not pride, loss of voices that will never be replicated. She wrote the capsule's measurements in her ledger, sketched the seam, and circled it with the crest's feathers. Not yet, she thought. Not until the path is safe. Curiosity would not outrun stewardship. She braced the worst beam with a scavenged timber and a screwjack that complained but held. She slid acid-free boards under boxes where the floor cupped. She labeled with pencil, not ink, letting the moment remain reversible. Outside, the wind pressed its palm against the panes. Inside, the silence was not empty. It was layered. Printer's oil, mouse dust, old leather fat, breath. At the doorway she had come through, the latch settled with a small sound, metal on metal, like punctuation. As the door closed behind her, the house seemed to listen. She paused, hand on the capsule in her pocket, feeling the cold through cotton. The weight of the discovery pressed on her far heavier than any price tag could. She kept cataloging. The capsule could wait until after she had a ledger of what still breathed. She would not let the relic dictate the order of care. She lifted another volume and found the crest again, impressed like a thumbprint. The wind rose. Somewhere within the walls, a space took a breath she couldn't yet name. She set her wants down in the ledger as if naming them could fix the joists. Safe entry, preservation, proof. The building answered with silence that felt like refusal. A cracked transom blinked salt light across her hands. Time was running out, yet every hurried step here became damage. She breathed, then began. She braced the buckled corridor with scavenged timbers scavenged from a collapsed shed, wedging them beneath the bowed ceiling. The screwjack moaned as she turned it. The floor lifted a finger's width, enough to coax a path without promising safety. She chalked arrows on boards to mark where weight could live. She mapped the load paths in her ledger, drawing lines like capillaries, guessing at how the house still moved. She wrapped her hair, masked her nose, and slid into the narrow gap she'd cut. The air tasted of lime and something older. Mold bit the back of her throat, so she slowed, let the dust fall around her instead of through her. At the end of the crawl, she peered into the stalled library. Rows of spines leaned like tired soldiers, the damp red as a faint white bloom along leather. She measured humidity with a small gauge, then cracked a window an inch, balancing airflow against intrusion. Every choice had a cost. Every breath in this room counted. At the north wall, she found a skim of plaster that rang wrong when she tapped it. Too high, too crisp. She scraped an inch and revealed newer brick, a seam that didn't match the house's original course. Behind the mortar, cold air slid over her skin, edged with the faint smell of oil. A sealed servant passage, likely retired when the family reduced staff, or secrets. She set the trowel aside. The temptation to pry surged, but the books breathed. She forced herself to back away. Save what breathes paper first. Chase mysteries second. Her mentor's voice was steady in her memory. A hand pressed gently between her shoulder blades. She turned to the nearest table and began triage. Inked indexes noted, cloth spines supported with linen wraps, boards interleaved with buffered paper. She wrote micro-notes, tide mark at tail, foxing minimal, plates intact. The house listened. A page fell loose as she shifted a folio. Sepia script knifed across the margin, precise, unafraid of space. The box must outlive me. The same crest hovered in the corner, 3 feathers and a knot. She felt the line pass from paper through muscle into resolve. She copied the phrase into her ledger, underlined once. The first failure arrived like weather. A pipe above the lower stacks coughed, then split a hairline that widened into a bright thread. Water beaded, gathered, began to fall. She threw a tarp over the nearest crates, rigged a rope to tilt the table surface into a bucket. She dragged a warped escritoire into position to lift boxes off the floor, every scrape a negotiation with the old boards. The drip accelerated, then steadied. She breathed with it, counting, adjusting, refusing to panic as labels smeared and paper swelled. In the lifting, the escritoire argued back. One leg stuck fast, the other skated. She wedged a book cradle under the stubborn side and heaved. The table rose an inch and spoke, a hollow knock from within its belly, not the open underdrawer, somewhere else. She set the weight down, ran her knuckles along the apron until the sound returned, soft as a heartbeat. A concealed drawer. She fetched a bone folder and coaxed the lip. The panel slid with a sigh, releasing a smell like trapped coins. Inside lay a shard of metal, small, beveled, its edges worn like a thing used often. Her mind built the silhouette against memory. The fused capsule's seam had carried a tiny indentation like a missing tooth. The shard's profile fit that absence exactly. Not a key, but something that behaved like one. A tongue made to meet a groove. The leak slowed as the bucket filled. She swapped it with a second, marked the time in her ledger, then wrapped the shard in unbleached muslin and tucked it beside the capsule she still refused to open. The house had offered a peace in the middle of argument. She accepted without celebrating. She returned to the false wall, touching the newer brick again. The oil-scented cold moved like a thought across her wrists. She set the pry bar, pressed gently, watched a single brick crumble at the corner. The cascade threatened. She stopped, swallowing the itch to break through. She could not win this room by force. She tightened the braces, relabeled the wet crates for immediate freeze-drying off-site when funds existed, and mopped the thin pools with blotter. The wind rose against the cliff. The library exhaled. On her way out, she brushed the soot line beneath the suspect shelf. The smear lifted onto her fingertip, fresh enough to stain. Someone had shifted this case often, long after the house pretended to sleep. She noted it and turned the latch. The door settled behind her, metal on metal. She stood in the corridors dim and felt the weight of the discovery press down again. The building had blocked her, leaked on her, then whispered a path. She hadn't failed. She had learned the rules. She wanted the truth, but not at the cost of the object's voice. The capsule sat on the table like a closed eye. The shard she'd found lay beside it, a tongue, waiting for a groove. If she forced it and scarred the metal, she would be the vandal they feared. If she hesitated, the trail might rot with the beams. The weight of history sat heavy in her hands. She chose care. She sealed the room, set bowls of desiccant, and watched the hygrometer fall. Cotton gloves on. A rubber mallet balanced in her palm like a metronome of patience. She cradled the capsule in one hand and introduced vibration with the other. Gentle taps along the seam, not to shatter, but to invite movement. The metal answered in increments, a change in pitch, a thin release of iron breath. She slid the beveled shard into the notch and felt the geometry catch. A twist, small as a confession. The seam loosened, the lid released with a quiet gasp. Inside, austerity. A thin silver locket no larger than a thumbnail, tarnish blooming like frost along its rim. A brass index tag stamped with exacting letters, A.32. A wafer of mica, translucent and stubborn, its surface etched with coordinates in a hand she already knew, disciplined, spare, the same as the marginalia. She held the locket first. It was heavier than it looked. She did not open it yet. She turned the brass tag in the light, the stamp crisp, the edges worn by fingers. A.32. A shelf? A panel? An argument with a labyrinth. Beneath the items, folded paper hugged the base, a ledger leaf torn from a larger book. She eased it out, breath held, and read. Confession Gallery. Access only through A32 panel. Do not disturb. The initials at the bottom were a set she had traced with her finger in dozens of book plates, the three feather crest's owner reduced to 2 letters and a tremor of ink. The house had not just hidden, it had catalogued what was hidden. She placed each piece on unbuffered tissue, sketched their arrangement, then reached for the ledger she'd been building. There was no room for speculation, only sequence. She wrote, capsule opened without heat. Shard acted as torque key. Contents, locket, closed. Brass tag, A.32. Mica wafer, coordinates. Leaf reference, confession gallery. Provenance thread strengthens across ex libris crest. At the back of the drawer lay another envelope, brittle and addressed in a different hand. Legal tone radiated even before she unfolded it. A solicitor's letter. Notice, undisclosed private holdings may be subject to trust dispute. Disclosure triggers review. The words sat like grit between teeth. She had seen collections vanish into litigation fog. She could not let this archive become leverage for people uninterested in its human truth. She stood, needing air that didn't smell like coin. On the wall, a portrait faced inward toward the plaster, a man's profile half seen in the frame's reflection. She lifted it down and pivoted it carefully. The canvas was ordinary, the backing was not. A penciled floor plan hid beneath the paper dust cover, sure lines with tiny annotations. Off the library, an unmarked rectangle, no door drawn, only a question where a wall should be. The crest appeared again in the corner, feathers faint. Someone had left a map exactly where a careful eye would eventually check. She returned to the library with the brass tag in her pocket. The watcher at the gate idled again, a car's distant rumble smearing the silence, then settling. She ignored it. The shelves loomed. She ran her fingers along each label, reading the ghost language of a long-vanished cataloger. A29, A30, A31. Her pulse climbed in measure to the numbers. A32 sat waist-high, innocuous, its books squat and plain, gazetteers and trade circulars, the camouflage of dullness. She lifted 2 volumes and found nothing but dust. She pressed lightly at the backboard. Stillness. She slid the brass tag along the shelf edge as if testing a lock that did not exist. A click, faint and precise, answered under her thumb. Not a keyhole. A runner. The shelf shifted a millimeter. She froze. then pressed again. The case rolled sideways on hidden hardware, a whisper of oiled wood and old intent. Cold breathed from the dark seam, washing her face with the smell of stone and stored years. She set a wedge to keep the passage open and listened. The house seemed to hold its breath. She reached for a chisel to widen the adjoining plaster at the floor where the floor plan's rectangle suggested a portal. The third tap wrong-footed the ceiling. A sag telegraphed through lath, a sift of dust, a warning. She stepped back, closed her eyes, and let the urge to push thin out. The building would punish hurry. Failure could come as collapse or as the quiet death of a brittle page. The distant engine returned, closer now, then stilled. Watching. She logged the shelf mechanism, noted the geometry of the runner, photographed the tag's interaction without flash. She slid the shelf back into place, closed the corridor's mouth, and sat on the floorboards to feel the cold rise through the wood. She opened the locket with her thumbnail. Inside, hair, fine, salt gray, bound with thread, and a slip of paper cut so small it bordered on refusal. 4 words, cramped. I hid us well. She set the locket beside the mica wafer and read the etched coordinates aloud, letting the numbers occupy the room. The ledger page, confession gallery, was no metaphor. A hidden room had a name and a rule, not for catalog, not for betrayal. The consequences were already circling in parked metal at her gate, in legal letters written to frighten caretakers into compliance. She would not be frightened. Before she left the table, she lifted the shard again. The bevel had been worn smooth by a thumb that had believed in repetition, in a ritual of opening and closing. She slid it back into its muslin sleeve, shut her ledger, and stood. The library had muttered instructions. She had listened. The next move would not be brute force. It would be an archivist's path. Document, test, return. And when the house consented, enter. She tied a nylon guideline to the brass rail at A32, a bright thread against carved oak, and looped the other end to her waist. The shelf sighed aside once more, revealing the slender seam of darkness. She slid on an N95, tucked desiccant packets into her pockets, and palmed a soft brush as if it were a talisman. The cold exhaled from the gap, clean and dry, like air that had not spoken to weather in decades. She sank to her knees and eased through. The corridor was narrow enough that her shoulders grazed paneling, dust lifting in light curls, then drifting back down like tired snow. Her lamp threw a steady oval. The air carried old oil, wax, and the metallic ghost of ink. Plaster here was absent. Wood met wood with tight seams, as if a cabinetmaker had been tasked with building a passage that felt like furniture. Tension sat in her chest with the threads bite at her waist. She wanted entry and verification. The corridor wanted to sway under weight, to pinch in blame, to turn one misstep into collapse. If she failed, she would not only be hurt, she would salt the archive with rescue dust and ruin. She advanced 2 shoe lengths at a time, tapping gently at the skirting, testing for voids. The floor answered with a muted uniformity that comforted her, then broke once into a hollow she marked with blue tape for the return. At elbow height, the paneling carried small brass nails, each head filed flush, and then stained to near invisibility. Her lamp caught one head's faint ring of tarnish and the implied rhythm of hands that checked them often. The weight of the discovery pressed on her far heavier than any price tag could. The corridor breathed colder, then opened into a room the size of a modest parlor. Her lamp's circle landed on paneled walls, honey-dark and uncracked, wood that had been sealed from the swell and shrink of coastal seasons. The floor lay bone dry. No mildew, no tide marks. In the center, a single case rested on low legs, its glass intact, its lock simple but stubborn. A hand-painted label fixed to its rim in a tidy script read, "Private Archive, not for catalog." She stood very still, letting the room's silence define its borders. Then she brushed the case, clearing fine dust in soft arcs. Inside, the first layer spoke of a life's deliberate residue. Letters bound with faded blue ribbon, their edges feathered but sound. A folio of sketches with darkened corners where fingers had paused. And nestled in velvet, a small corroded mechanical device. Cylinders within a ring, teeth like a clock's, but cut with uncommon care. The Relic. Her hand hovered above it, then withdrew. Desire would not get to touch first. She pivoted the case slightly and found a second, slimmer trunk tucked beneath a hinged panel. It was locked. The silver locket in her pocket warmed at the thought. She eased it out and examined the hinge again. The pin, no wider than a needle, could lift. She worried it free, set it against the trunk's tiny escutcheon, and pressed. The lock turned with a private click that felt like a breath being kept for too long and finally released. Inside, paper in ranks. Notarized affidavits with seals stamped flat by time. Patent drafts drawn in a meticulous engineer's hand. Dated photographs printed in sepia that showed prototypes staged against this very paneling. The device in the velvet appeared in those frames, less corroded, more audacious. Along the bottom of one photograph, the familiar initials appeared beside another, more famous name. The pairing, a bruise in ink. She read until the tidy order turned to a tremor. The Manor's forgotten owner had drafted a mechanism, an early energy storage encoder, a memory held without power that predated a globally recognized patent by years. The diagrams carried geometry later celebrated in journals, but here they were as seedlings, annotated with doubts and triumphs, signed in the crest's hand. The more famous name, the one engraved in museums, appeared in contracts that coiled like rope around the inventor's wrists, assignments, releases, the soft violence of signatures under pressure. The truth was worse for someone alive only in foundation plaques and award speeches. Erasure had not happened by neglect. It had been performed with coordination. The house wasn't merely abandoned, it had been silenced, so the narrative could stand untroubled in public glass. She slid the relic from its velvet, a small weight, colder than the room, its teeth catching light in a way that announced intention. On its rim, a mark repeated, an index to the photograph's captions. She turned it once and felt resistance that was not rust. It was a designed stop, a secret reset. The weight of history sat heavy in her hands. She returned it to velvet, unwilling to let her curiosity write new wear into old metal. A scuff sounded above, weight testing a path, the small complaint of a floorboard that had always told the truth. She killed her lamp with a thumb. The dark settled with the clarity of a closed book. She lowered her breath, letting her chest take in smaller measures, the way one does in a reading room when someone enters who does not like to be noticed. Footfalls crossed the room overhead. One, then two, then a pause that felt like listening. She pressed her palm flat to the paneling and felt the timber translate pressure into language. Patient, careful, unwelcome. The watcher had stepped inside. Her guideline tugged lightly at her waist. She counted heartbeats, the room keeping time with her. In the darkness, the letters seemed to grow warmer by proximity alone, their bound silence shifting from object to ally. She thought of the marginal note, "I hid us well." Above, a heel turned. Boards whispered. The house held its breath again. She waited, spine aligned with oak, brush in hand as if it could double as a blade, and listened for the next move, the audible hinge between discovery and risk. She surfaced from the dark with the relic's chill still ghosting her palm. The corridor exhaled her back into the library, where salt light lay thin across the floor. Before her eyes could adjust, a shadow leaned in the doorway, tailored coat, an umbrella too clean for this house. He smiled like a man visiting a storage unit. "Structural assessment," she said evenly, sliding her body between him and A32. The shelf looked ordinary again. His gaze darted once, cataloging. He named the crest without glancing at a spine. 3 feathers, a knot. Family mark. Heard it's hiding junk the courts forgot to count. He produced crisp pages from a leather folio. Letter of intent. Disposal services. We remove hazards. Storage, too. Cash today for... He gestured vaguely at dust. This. It read as a lowball for silence. She kept her voice neutral. Not a sale, a stabilization effort. He laughed softly. Preservation is expensive. Lawsuits are more so. She watched how his fingers rested on the folio, confident, impatient. Casual boasts unfurled like ribbons. He represented a consortium. There were heirs, distant, impatient. A quiet trust that disliked surprises. He named 3 surnames and a foundation that funded exhibitions celebrating the very industrialist whose contracts lay in the hidden case, names she wrote later in her mind. She remembered a technician's notebook once stripped of its author's tag in a museum back room, the discovery retitled under a curator's smile. She had carried that small theft like a stone. Not again, not here. She steadied her breath. "You'll have supervised access tomorrow," she offered, voice calm. 1 hour. I need to confirm safe load and air quality. She framed it in the antiseptic diction of liability. He weighed her and nodded as if granting mercy. "Tomorrow, then." His smile glinted. "Or sooner, if the building fails inspection." He left a card with a silver crest embossed into nothing. He turned to go, then added, almost kindly, "Demolition goes faster than cataloging." Lightning blinked far off over the water. He walked to a waiting car, engine purring. He did not drive away. He settled under the yews, lights dead, patient as a cat. She texted a single line to a trusted journalist, a 32 holds, then sent coordinates without names. The message hung unsent for a beat. The storm closed its hand, and the bars fell to nothing. Power coughed and died. The house clenched, the wind shoving salt into seams. Outside, the rival's car remained, a dark pupil watching. Time thinned. She moved by headlamp, triaging boxes into zones, building a satchel with the bare minimum of proof she would need if the walls declared mutiny. The locket lay in her pocket, a small pulse. She ran fingers along the carved crest above the fireplace, 3 feathers, a knot, seeking the pattern that had repeated since morning. A knot is a promise. A knot is also a mechanism. Her thumb found a burr where polish had worn thin. She pressed, then pressed sideways. Wood whispered. Somewhere inside the panel, a latch lifted, like a phrase finishing its grammar. A section of wainscot rose at the corner, slow and obedient, revealing a stair no wider than her shoulders, cut into the wall like a memory kept with teeth. Confession Gallery, the ledger had named it. She breathed once. The air from the seam came faint, dry, archival, and then closed the panel half down to hide the seam. She listened. The rival's patience hummed at the gate. The storm moved, rain stitching fast across glass. She met him at the threshold with her headlamp lowered so he had to blink. "We'll need to schedule that supervisor," he said, false friendly. "The county can shut a site like this fast if they smell hazard." He said injunction, as if it were weather. She said intake protocol, as if it were law. The storm swallowed their words and left only tone. He leaned in, scent clean, coin sharp. Some archives do better when they disappear. She didn't step back. Some legacies do better when someone tells the truth. He smiled without teeth and retreated to his car. Lights off again. The storm felled a branch somewhere out of sight. The house registered it as a shudder. She sealed her satchel, tucked affidavits and negatives she'd already sleeved, then placed the relic in a hollowed encyclopedia titled River Commerce, Volume 3, a commonplace disguise that felt like a blessing. The satchel would travel if she failed. The book would stay if she fell. Phone signal remained dead. The car outside idled, then quieted. She spoke to the dark. "You are a witness. I am only hands." She reached for the crest again. The panel lifted fully this time, revealing the gallery mouth like a kept promise. She stepped inside. Behind her, the Manor's old door clicked, the sound too deliberate for wind. The rival had chosen his hour. The light in the gallery flickered as if startled. Time was gone. The stair released her into a chamber that felt like breath held for decades. Paneling wrapped the room in a hush. Her lamp rose and the walls answered with constellations, pinholes arranged in grids and spirals, faint threads mapping relationships between names written in a careful, steady hand. The air was dry enough to tick in her nose. The gallery had been engineered to keep memory intact. She set the satchel down and moved along the first wall. Small shelves held wax cylinders labeled in graphite. Interviews 19. The last 2 digits smudged. Beside them, onion skin transcripts lay weighted with washers, margins annotated with the crest owner's tidy script. She chose one page, then another, and the story began to climb out of the paper. Partnership, it said without ornament. Joint work on an encoder capable of holding a charge without bleed. The famous industrialist, his surname inked only once, then referred to by initial, had arrived with money, laboratories, a legal team that spoke in clauses. Releases were drafted. The inventors signed, then appended amendments the lawyers swatted away. A line, underscored twice. "He says my invention is safer in his hands. He says the public will never know the difference." She threaded a cylinder onto a portable playback she'd carried for years for exactly this kind of moment. The horn breathed a low static, then a voice, measured, older than the letters, steady to the point of defiance. "I am dictating so the ink cannot be taken from me," the voice said. Agreements were signed under duress. There were threats the papers will never show. If you are hearing this, it means the gallery did its work. She closed her eyes, letting timbre corroborate ink. The tone matched the margins. The cadence matched the notes in the ledger. The small impatience with wasted words. She opened her eyes and examined a photo pinned with brass. The device on the table in the picture shared the relic's geometry, nested cylinders, a ring etched with indices. The industrialist's later patent, clipped from a journal and pasted beside it, displayed identical outlines masquerading as innovation. Her lamp found a second case on a side table, smaller, styled like a child's trunk. The label was almost tender. For the child, when ready. She worked the clasp and felt the familiar slide of a mechanism built by the same hands that had hidden A32. Inside, a portfolio tied with twine. Then, a folded document, heavy with seals. Affidavits. Witness statements from machinists and clerks who had seen drafts moved and signatures pressed. A letter from a notary who had refused to certify a coerced release. A line that burned. Payment refused because payment would make it consent. Beneath, a card with an address, a name marked Heir. She pressed her thumb against the ink as if warmth could steady it. The fortune was not a chest. It was attribution, back pay, dignity. Royalties accrue by law even when stories are bent. She heard her mentor again. Stewardship is value in motion. Put the right thing in the right hands, and it multiplies. She returned to the relic to test what the documents implied. She lifted it free and aligned its indices with the photographs. A notch on the rim matched a pencil mark in the margin. Set here, measure drift. She turned the ring until the notch met the mark, felt the designed resistance, the taut pause before alignment. Not a battery, an encoder core, a way to search, a way to store a signature of energy and call it back. Her palms tingled as if old voltage had memory. She set it down gently. The truth was sharper now. Not rumor, but mechanism. On the far wall, thread led to a single sheet written in a different hand, softer loops, the intimacy of a private letter. I hid this where only someone who loves the books would look. You will find me in the margins. If you can, return my name to the device I built. The sentence landed like a hand on her shoulder. She had been the intended reader all along. The lamp flickered. Footsteps struck the stair, slow, becoming certain. The rival had found the seam. The gallery's light steadied itself as if bracing. She moved fast without rushing. Chain of custody first. She photographed each wall in quadrants, cards in frame with time and initials. She spoke into her recorder. Confession gallery entered at contents, cylinders, transcripts, affidavits, photographs, relic. She placed the heir's packet in the satchel, then added duplicates the creator had already prepared, carbon copies folded beneath originals like shadows ready to travel. On the audio shelf, she selected one cylinder marked Release, Coerced, and one marked Partnership, Terms Revoked. She slipped them into padded sleeves. On the desk, she found a tissue envelope of glass negatives, edges scalloped, dates scratched into emulsion. She packed them in a box cradle and slotted them beside the relic's velvet bed. The stair creaked again. A small splinter of light showed beneath the door, then vanished as a body blocked it. The knob tested once. She looked to the ceiling and found a pull string disguised as decorative braid. She tugged. The gallery light dimmed to a whisper, enough for her to see, not enough for a stranger to orient. She took one breath, cool and crisp, and made the decision the room had already asked of her. Copies to press, originals to air, ledger to the trust. She slid the locket from her pocket and placed it atop the smallest transcript. "I hid us well," the slip inside had said. She closed her hand around the satchel strap until the canvas bit into skin. The knob turned fully. The panel shivered. Above, thunder rolled anger along the cliff. She moved to the hinge and braced, not to fight, but to hold the opening small enough that the gallery could protect itself for one more minute. Time was gone, but the record was ready to walk. The panel jolted, then swung inward a hand's width. His silhouette filled the seam, rain stippling the shoulders of his coat. "You can end this the easy way," he murmured, voice low to keep the storm from stealing it. "Hand me the satchel. We'll certify what's real and dispose of what isn't." She didn't move. "What you call disposal is erasure." He smiled in the dark. "Same result. Faster." She shifted her weight and spoke for the record, voice steady. "Confession gallery, under intrusion by external claimant." She raised her phone like an amulet, the voice memo's red dot bright as a coal. He reached. She slid sideways, using the hinge as leverage, kept the opening narrow. His fingers brushed canvas. The room answered with its own defense. A beam overhead groaned, dust sighing down like powdered bone. She didn't flinch. She photographed fast, walls, cylinders, affidavits, with a clipped cadence, her initials and the minute spoken before each shutter. She sealed envelopes, pressed wax, stamped dates. The relic she had hidden already inside River Commerce Volume 3, its hollow rebacked with rice paste earlier in the day, sat quietly on the side table like a harmless encyclopedia no one would covet. She slipped letters into a canvas satchel, the heirs packet atop everything else like a compass. He forced another inch, calling the documents forgeries with a practiced contempt. "A foundation will devour this," he warned. "Courts, too. You're out of your depth." She answered in museum language, cool and impersonal. Affidavits notarized, negatives dated in emulsion. Chain of custody initiated, courier scheduled for pickup. Add destruction to your list and you inherit criminal penalties. He blinked at the word courier, calculation flickering. The house chose the moment. A deep groan ran through lath. Plaster rained like weather. He stumbled forward. A shelf pitched, heavy with boxes, and swung down in a slow, murderous arc. She lunged, catching the corner with both hands, shoulders burning, then jammed a book truck beneath the weight to keep it from crushing him. He stared, stunned, dust whitening his hair. She dragged him clear, her breath ripping in her chest. "Ethics before victory," her mentor had said. She set him against the paneling, palms on her knees. "You don't get to be injured by what you tried to break, then own it," she said, not unkind. He found his voice and offered cash. The notes you could smell, even through rain and plaster. A number spoken like a sedative. Stay quiet. Walk away. She shook her head once. Stewardship is not for sale. He surged, snatching at the satchel. She moved sharper than he expected, slid backward through the seam and slapped her palm against the shelf runner hidden at A32. The mechanism answered with a clean metallic lock. The corridor narrowed to a rib's width, sealing like a chest after a deep breath. His knock turned dull. It sounded like regret. Sirens braided through the storm, thin at first, then gathering strength. Neighbors, the storm, the earlier branch, everything conspiring to call attention here. He heard them too, and his poise cracked. "You'll drown in lawyers," he hissed, already retreating. She answered with the only promise she could keep. I will drown in paper. That's the work. She slid into the corridor, shoulder brushing paneling, lamp low. The guideline tugged. She let it lead her back to the library. The house swayed once, then settled. At A32, she rolled the shelf shut and heard the runner seat itself like a line drawn under a name. In the main room, rain blew through the window she had cracked for airflow. She pulled it tight, wiped her hands on her jeans, tasted salt and old dust. She moved quick and clean, photos and negatives cushioned, affidavits sealed. The satchel's strap crossed her shoulder like a bandolier. River Commerce went to a mid-shelf behind 3 rows, the hollow weight of the relic now indistinguishable from a reference book's reserve. She bent, lifted the floor wedge she had placed to hold the servant passage, and pressed the crest switch at the fireplace. The wainscot rose, the narrow stair gaped. The storm boomed. The sirens widened. At the threshold, he materialized again, soaked, a last reach in him. He lunged. She pivoted and let the heavy shelf kiss the back of his hand. He shouted, more surprise than pain. She didn't gloat. She stepped into the servant passage and pulled the panel down. Darkness held her like a clean glove. The passage breathed, damp and stone. She counted steps, hand on the guideline she'd set earlier, feet remembering the hollow she had marked with tape. Above, doors threw voices through the manor, neighbors, responders, the rival choosing a story at speed. She exited into the scullery, then into rain that felt like daylight after rooms designed to hoard shadow. She crossed the yard low, the satchel tucked under her coat, salt needling her face. At the lane, she paused and looked back. The house's windows glowed the way eyes glow in old portraits when you move across a room. She lifted a hand, not goodbye, not triumph, a promise. She stepped into the road, sirens sliding closer, the archive heavy and correct against her ribs. The cliff pines bent in the wind like scribes leaning over a page. The weight in her hands was not money. It was story with proof. It would outlive weather. It would outlive her. She logged, boxed, duplicated, and delivered. Trust, air, journalist, each receipt a stitch. The article landed. Attribution followed like rain after fever. In the manor, the silence lightened. A last marginal note surfaced. If you found this, you knew to listen. She placed the locket beside it and let the gallery rest. The gallery door clicked shut, not as a burial, but as a promise kept. Subscribe now and tell us where you're watching from. Join the journey and help uncover the hidden truths waiting inside rust, ink, and carved wood.